Okay, so we've reached All Night, and I don't have too much to say about this one. It's usually the one I will skip the most on the album. But it's not the worst song in the world, and I am willing to let the band off the hook with this one, mainly because of Mutt Lange's name on the writing credits. I definitely think it's more of a Mutt Lange thing than it is a Def Leppard thing. I definitely hear this style of song approach with Mutt's work with Bryan Adams, on songs like Hey Honey, I'm Packing You In, and, Touch the Hand even. It's definitely that kind of style of a bit more of a silly lyric. It's not very serious, it's just a bit of fun music. It's a bit of a groove to it. So you can maybe say it's similar in vein to like Sugar or even Excitable. It's just something a bit different for the album, But yeah, it's not one of my favourites, but there's a couple of interesting guitar parts in here that you can maybe compare. Although one thing is, I never thought I'd hear this kind of funky guitar riff in a Def Leppard song. This cliched kind of they use it in this kind of phrase. But it's that kind of cliched, like funky guitar riff you'd normally associate with someone like Prince or even like an NXS type of riff, I guess. So that's something a bit different. But yeah, guitar-wise, there's a lot of like little parts filling in the gaps, which aren't necessarily like the most complicated, but kind of do their job. You can maybe say the chorus is again similar in vein to Sugar. It's that kind of rhythm at the opening. It's kind of like. Then you got a little lick in between, something like. And along with that, you've got like the lead guitar just staying on one note again, like the lead guitar in the Sugar chorus. You have something like this. Just one guitar holding that kind of note there. And you hear that a lot on the kind of later Def Leppard stuff. If there's two guitar parts in the chorus, they will use a second guitar just to kind of play something like that, just to kind of fill up the sound. I think that's pretty much it guitar-wise. Vocally, again, it's pretty much fine. Backing vocals sound cool. There's more of a groove on this song with the bass and the drums, so they have more of a forefront. But what I like about this, if there's anything to like about it from my perspective, is you can kind of hear Mutt more on his own on some of the backing vocal parts, like during the verses, and I think you can definitely hear him isolated on the bridge. So it's always cool to be able to like pinpoint what his voice sounds like, because usually you only hear it in the context of like probably a million different layered Mutts and everyone else. So I do like that aspect about the song, but not much else, I'm afraid. So let's quickly move on to the best track of the album, I would say, Paper Sun. Right, so Paper Sun, I think, is the perfect example of the something old and something new fusing together to create such a great song. And for me, it's easily the best song on the album. But before I go into particular what elements they are, which have been fused together, there's a couple of things I want to try and say about this song, which I've been having trouble trying to formulate my words with. So I'll just basically say 3 basic points. One, this for me proves that Def Leppard with Vivian can write a great classic sounding Leppard song, and which is heavy. It's got balls, it's got melody, it's got all the production points there. This proves to me that they can definitely write in that style and be successful. There's a reason why this song can still be played today live. It just seems to hit all the buttons. 2, I don't think they've utilised this style of song enough in the kind of post-Steve era. We've had songs like this, Day After Day, which I'll get to, Scar on the X or 10 album, Wings of an Angel on the most recent album. You can maybe say Go as well from songs from the Sparkle Lounge. These are the ones that kind of have all the elements of that kind of, I guess what we would call the classic epic kind of Def Leppard song. And these songs prove to me that they're still capable of writing them. I just don't think they write enough of them. And I think that's maybe where they get tagged as being, not as heavy anymore in the Vivian era, when really, they're still very capable. I just hope that they write more songs like this, basically. And my final point would be, I would have loved to have heard what Steve could have come up with if he was allowed free reign into writing something, as dark and as heavy as this. If Desert Song's anything to go by, then I'm sure he would have flourished in writing in this style, definitely. Okay, so now we'll move on to the elements to make up the song, and I'll try and explain why it works so well in fusing the kind of classic sound and the new sound together. And I'm mainly going to be focusing on the guitar parts, but, vocal-wise, backing vocal-wise, production-wise, it's all there, it's all good, it ticks the boxes. But I mainly want to show some of these cool guitar parts, because you might be surprised what they reference back to here. So even if we just start with like the intro, we're hearing more exotic sounding intervals being used here, which is, even though the riff isn't necessarily mimicking anything we've heard before, it's definitely using the similar kind of intervals we'd be used to hearing on something like Pyromania. We're hearing these kind of chord shapes here, like different kind of voicings, instead of just the kind of power chord stuff that we heard before and something like, Demolition Man. And even if you're not a guitar player, I think you do appreciate hearing something a bit more exotic. It definitely keeps your ears interested rather than just constant power chord chugging, I guess you'd call it. But sticking with that intro, I think what's cool about that as well is that you've got the intro sound, you've got the kind of verse variation of the chords, which is kind of what I played there. But even when you get to the pre-chorus, you're hearing the same chords, but used in a different way. And it just, again, that's another factor that kind of keeps it from becoming boring. You got this variation. So all these little things I think add up and just keep the song moving. Now, if we go back to the intro, or the kind of second part of the intro, once everything comes in, you hear this guitar part which sounds something like this. And I think that's a cool little reference back to the Women intro, this kind of lick here. It's not exactly the same kind of notes, but I definitely think it's a reference back, because in both instances, you hear Joe kind of mimic the melody with his, with a couple of layered voices together. It's not quite like a scream or anything, but it's just subtly enhances the kind of guitar part there. And that's one of the main things which I always thought about mentioning in a video, to kind of say, oh look, here's a cool little reference back to Women. So that's one of them there. If we move on to the verse again, this isn't a guitar part, but if you hear what the bass is doing, it's kind of on this kind of rhythm, which I think is a little callback to like Billy's Got a Gun in the verses. It's definitely that type of groove. And then it's not until we get to the bridge that I say we have the kind of the modern sounding Leopard make a big statement. I really love this kind of bridge riff, the one just kind of goes like this. Really heavy power chord chugging that we're not really used to hearing in a Def Leppard song, but I think works so well. And again, you hear kind of weird changes in there. It's like, or even, which to me is very like slang sounding in its kind of alternative approach, but really doesn't feel out of place at all. And I think that's the key thing here. And then you go into the next part of the bridge, which I think is a more classic sounding like Leopard riff, which kind of goes like this. It's not necessarily like anything we've heard before, but I think it's similar vein to like one of the bridges in White Lightning, which is kind of, it's like similar kind of chord shapes, and you're around a similar area. I think that one's like, and even something similar to one of the parts on Through the Night. I don't know, it just reminds me of these kind of parts, that, like where I play them on the neck. This kind of part here. You know, for me, it's like, you know, Def Leppard have used that kind of bridge approach like a few times before. So I think that's why that reminds me of that. And then, of course, you have the solo, which Vivian's just able to let loose, which is great. And, you know, you'd hope he'd be able to do that a lot more often. Because it's really cool solo. It's like, it's not necessarily all shreddy. There's a lot of shred elements in there. I mean, it's not an easy one to play, but it does hold a lot of nice melody in there too. And then riff-wise, I guess the only other one you could say harkens back to classic Leopard is right at the end. There's a similar kind of arpeggio shape on like the last little really shreddy part Phil does. Like underneath is like a similar arpeggio to like the ending of Foolin', which is like... you know, there's something like that underneath there at the very end. I don't think it's exactly like that. That's what the Foolin' one sounds like anyway. But that's another part I would say references back to that kind of classic Leopard sound. So yeah, I mean, that's maybe my argument for why this song is what I think the best on the album, and why, you know, a lot of people like Paper Sun, is because it does have those classic elements in there that maybe you don't notice. But it's, you know, it's fused together with the modern sounding vocal approach, the backing vocals being a lot more on the forefront. There's some modern sounding riffs in there, but it's definitely got a hint of the classic stuff in there as well. Right, so I don't think I would have much to say about All Night, but I have even less to say about this one, I'm afraid. Again, it's not a bad song. It's just doesn't do enough for me, I guess. But, you know, it's a decent enough little ballad. And again, it's another example of Def Leppard doing that type of ballad, which isn't like, you know, a power ballad. You know, it's just more of a straightforward kind of love song, I guess. One interesting point, which I think is like foreshadowing for kind of the future ballads that we hear more so on like X or 10, is the kind of use of like an odd chord in the chorus, which just kind of takes you away from the kind of usual sound and makes it a bit more, gives it a bit more depth, I guess. But so like the chorus progression in this one kind of goes like F, C, E flat, B flat. So like, but then the second time round, when it gets that C major chord, it makes it a C minor, which kind of takes you outside. And I think you hear that kind of thing a lot more on the kind of more recent kind of ballads. Like especially, I think numerous songs on X kind of do that. You know, instead of just like staying within the key and making it more predictable sounding, they choose to kind of go to an odd chord, which kind of gives it maybe like a little Beatles vibe in their more kind of psychedelic era. But again, guitar part wise, you know, there's a lot of little arpeggios in there, but nothing really stands out to me as being like referencing back to the kind of classic sound. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that and move on to 21st Century Shalalala Girl. Right, so 21st Century Shalalala Girl. I like this song, you know, it's definitely got that sing-along chorus vibe, it's melodic. The backing vocals again are absolutely huge. And but once again, it's mainly the backing vocals and the production style which tie it back to that classic Leopard sound for me. Everything else is a bit more modern sounding. You can maybe say like the verses are kind of like a Pour Some Sugar on Me vibe with the kind of bass and drums and It's a bit of a rap vocal, I guess. But a lot of the guitar parts are not what I would say is typical Leopard. Again, it's a lot more power chord based stuff, like I was saying before with Demolition Man, and there's a lot more kind of chromatic kind of guitar parts in there, similar to what we'd find on Slang. So the opening riff is, you would say it's maybe a traditional opening guitar riff, but it's not one I would say is Leopard like. The pre-chorus riff I think is really cool, which I'll play, which I think is an example of like a very modern sounding kind of riff, that kind of chromatic part at the end, was very kind of Slang era onwards, and it's very, power chord chunky. The chorus riff's pretty cool again, but again it's around that kind of power chord shape. Which we're not kind of used to with a classic Leopard sound. One thing which is quite funny is that at the end it modulates, so it goes from this kind of chorus riff. In fact, I'll play the original chorus riff into the modulated one so you can hear it. So the first one. It changes. It goes up 2 steps. And what's funny is that Def Leppard do a lot of key changes in their songs, especially in the classic era, but they never do what you'd call, that's like a typical kind of modulation at the end of a song. I think I've heard it being referenced as it's the trucker changing gear kind of chord, key change, I should say. Like at the end of, it's like at the end of all pop songs. I think Man in the Mirror is the kind of one of the famous ones. At the end, if you want to add another 30 seconds onto your song, just have a key change at the chorus, and it keeps everyone interested. So it's funny that Def Leppard never really do that. I'm trying to think if they've done it in any other songs in that kind of obvious style. Nothing springs to mind straight away. But it's quite funny that, it's got that kind of, it's got a classic element in there, but done in a new way, or a more typical kind of way. But yeah, I think that's it pretty much guitar wise. Again, like I said, the main thing which kind of ties it back, and the main thing I like about this song, is the backing vocals and how they're produced, right in your face as usual. Okay, so To Be Alive. Now, I've grown to really like this song, and what I think's weird is that when I was younger, I don't think I ever gave it a chance. I never listened to it all the way through, and it wasn't until a mate of mine gave me the Vivian's side band Clock, their album, that I listened to this song fully, because it's Vivian's song, of course, and it's on that album. It's more like stripped back. I think it's just like acoustic guitar and piano. But the main thing about the song, which I really, really love, which is in both versions, is the solo, the kind of harmony slide guitar solo. And I'm sure when I first heard that, when I heard some of the kind of harmony parts on it, it gave me goosebumps. And it's like, usually that's a good sign of you liking something in a song. So of course now I've come to really like the song, and also the Def Leppard version. And it's funny because it makes me think that maybe in a parallel universe, what Def Leppard could have done if they wanted to kind of step away from that typical Def Leppard sound, what they should have done was just take a bunch of Vivian Campbell songs and leopardify them, kind of like what they did with this one, and on, future songs like Only the Good Die Young. Because it definitely has a different feel about it. And even though this does have some typical Def Leppard riffs in there, you can definitely hear it's just a different song altogether. It's got a completely different foundation about it in terms of the chord progressions and that, and even the kind of main melodies. So I'll try and go over some of those typical Leppard parts. Like in the intro, kind of underneath the verses, you've got this kind of lick going on, which I would say is the kind of typical Leppard. It's like I kind of played that out of order there, but it's that kind of idea there. So that just kind of brings that kind of subtle guitar part in there, which we're kind of used to, just emphasizes the kind of the chord progression and the melody. And even in the kind of pre-chorus part, there's one guitar which does this, which isn't the one I want to highlight, but I'm just, for to let you know what part I'm talking about. There's a bit where the guitar goes. Well, underneath that is another cool guitar part which just does this. And for some reason, I really like that. Like, it just reminds me of like an Andy Summers like riff from, Don't Stand So Close to Me or something like that. Just little parts here and there. It's just like on their own don't really sound great, but I think they do add to the overall production. So yeah, so in terms of the rest of the song, again, the backing vocals are on point. The melodies are cool, even if they are a little bit out there. But I think that, the song works well as being like a contrast to the rest of the album. And I think if the other slow songs were as more in depth or had a little bit more about them in a niche way, the way this one does, definitely stands out, then I think you'd have a really cool album there as having songs like this contrast with the more up-tempo rockers. If the up-tempo rockers were the ones which had all the simple guitar parts, then, go mental on the slower ones, put as many as you can without ruining the song, obviously. But yeah, like I say, I really enjoy this one, even if it's just something a bit different. But like I say, I do like the idea of thinking that, I wonder what a full album would sound like if the band just took like Vivian's songs and tried to leopardize them as much as possible. I think it might be an interesting mix of songs there, and maybe something they should think about doing. Right, so now we've moved on to Disintegrate, which is the instrumental of the album. And I've seen it referred to as being like Phil's Switch. And even though I've referred to it like that in the past, I don't think that does justice to either of the songs. They're definitely two different types of instrumentals. You can maybe say Steve's Switch is more like, building on a simple theme into something more complicated in the end, where everything kind of ties back into each other. Whereas Phil's Switch is more about, I should say Phil's Disintegrate is more about like separate interesting sections and the use of more kind of exotic scales and solos over those sections, just different exotic melodies over different sections, basically. But I do think this has a classic sound to it, and I do think Phil is good at trying to keep that kind of classic sound going in the more modern era songs. The one kind of main guitar part that sticks out to me as being classic sounding is this section here where the guitar underneath does something like this. The use of those two chords there, those different types of intervals is definitely for me feels like the kind of Pyromania style riffage. And then of course the second part on top of that, the one that kind of goes like, again, I would call that's like your typical kind of lead guitar part over that rhythm section underneath there. But in terms of where it kind of goes into its own thing, would be the use of, like I said, the exotic kind of sounding parts, like, uses these type of chords. Which I think makes it a little bit different there. There's one guitar part which I think you could say fuses the something old, something new together quite well, would be right at the end. It's like a typical Def Leppard arpeggiation of a chord, but the chords underneath that you're arpeggiating or hitting single notes of are not typical Def Leppard. So it's this part at the end. It kind of goes something like. It's that part there. It's like, I mean, that type of arpeggiation of that chord, we hear that a lot in the kind of classic Leopard songs, but those types of chords, like I showed earlier, are just a bit different, a bit more exotic than what we're used to. So that's pretty much it guitar-wise. I mean, the main melody is a nice sounding melody, and I think it goes a little bit outside the box. But I don't think there's anything else I could really talk about. Oh yeah, one thing I think that's pretty cool about the drums or the percussion, especially how like the hi-hats sound. I think that's definitely like a product of its time. That definitely reminds me of like movie soundtracks you'd hear in like the late 90s or even early 2000s. It's like, I don't know if you call it techno or kind of dance, but it's like that kind of industrial sounding, it's like a real drummer couldn't play those type of hi-hat hits. But yes, that's something that's cool, which I've always thought was a little bit different to hear in that kind of context. Right, so we've made it to Guilty. Now, this again is another one of my favorites from the album, and one of the major songs that made me want to make a video showing all the references on this album back to the classic days. It's a bit weird because I hear a lot of people don't like this song, but for me, it's like it's got everything you want in like a typical Leopard song. I mean, maybe it sounds a bit more mature, and that doesn't have the screaming dual vocal. But for me, it's like, it's a really nice animal sounding verse with a cool Hysteria sounding chorus. And I think the vocals and the melodies are great. Again, the backing vocals sound really cool. It's really fun to sing along to. And some of the lines on the bridge and on the outro chorus with the backing vocals, I think sound killer. But yeah, so let me try and run through the all the little references back to the classic days. And if we start with the intro, I mean, this isn't necessarily like a rip-off of any riff. I guess it's just a styling of it. Just as like that typical kind of, Leopard arpeggiation of a chord, like... if you hear that kind of thing a lot on songs like Hysteria. Then we get to the verse, and yeah, it's pretty much like a sibling to Animal, especially the clean kind of chime hits, like I don't think it's necessarily that chord, it's probably more like something like that. But even the kind of rhythm underneath, like definitely takes you back to that kind of Animal feel. And then if we move on to the chorus, we've got kind of two major guitar parts which are pretty much similar to kind of how Hysteria sounds. You've kind of got one guitar doing this, which of course is like the Hysteria guitar, which does, And then the second guitar on the Guilty chorus does this. Which of course is like the second guitar on Hysteria, which does this. Now, although these are more like rip-off riffs, I don't necessarily feel that this is like a rip-off song. I think it's a clever use of those kind of classic Leopard sounding licks. In a way, I think this song has more of its own identity compared to, let's say, Let's Go on the most recent album, which to me sounds more like a Pour Some Sugar on Me clone, even though it doesn't necessarily have similar kind of riffs in the way Guilty has similar riffs to, Animal or Hysteria. But I don't know if that's just me or not. I mean, you guys might feel differently. But I do really like this song. And like I said about the backing vocals, what's the line in the bridge I really like? Like the part, I think it's mostly you can hear Phil layered up, where it's like, my lips are sealed. And then again at the very end, it's like, and I said I was innocent. Those two lines there, I really like. Now, Day After Day. Again, I love this song. I think it's great. I think it's one of the best, up there with Paper Sun and Promises. So I think I'd rank it like favorite song, Paper Sun, and maybe Promises, Day After Day, Guilty, and then I don't know, tough choice for the rest of them. But what's weird is that I remember reading a review saying like Day After Day was like one of the throwaway tracks on the album. I couldn't believe it, because it's always been one of my favorites. And again, I think that's because it makes real good use of the kind of classic Leopard elements the way Paper Sun did. And you can maybe say that this one is more of a clone than Paper Sun was. I mean, I think this is definitely like a Too Late for Love clone, and in a guitar way, not necessarily in the rest of the song. But I'll try and show that here. So what it does is it makes use of, again, these kind of chord shapes, which you'd find mostly on like Pyromania, and especially on Too Late for Love. So like the main kind of verse progression follows these chords. These are all kind of major dyads, I guess you'd call them. And that's what Too Late for Love does. You know, Too Late for Love mainly uses those chords, like in the verses. I mean, in the chorus, I should say. But what I think is cool about Day After Day is it takes that chord shape and it puts it in a chord progression which is something you wouldn't have found back in the Leopard day, a more modern progression. So you basically have like three major chords, all spaced evenly apart, which you wouldn't normally find, but they do kind of work well in this context. In fact, it's kind of similar to like I Want to Be a Hero. The chords in the verses they're kind of three major chords in the same kind of pattern, which you wouldn't normally expect. But like I say, here it's making use of that kind of Too Late for Love shape, you know. And it's putting a new spin on it. So although you could say it's like a Too Late for Love clone, it's not a clone in a bad way. It's kind of like not like a remaster, but just something a bit different. And again, you can hear that in the pre-chorus as well, which is kind of like the bridge in Too Late for Love. So the pre-chorus in Day After Day is something like you know, and the kind of bridge or B section in Too Late for Love, you know, of course, sounds very similar. It goes like, you know, so it's like similar chord shapes there, but it's pretty much an identical rhythm. You know, if you play them back to back, it doesn't sound odd at all. You know, it's like. You know, again, so it's given us something we've heard before. It's putting like a different spin on it, which I think is pretty cool. And again, similar to Paper Sun, it's got a really cool bridge where it gives us like a very modern sounding power chord riff. Let's see if I can play it. I remember it was really hard at the time, but it's something like. You know, that's very. It's very much a product of its time, that kind of alternative 90s kind of rock there. So like I say, that's the guitar parts that kind of take us back to the kind of classic sound. But again, the bass in the verse is something that it's like kind of yeah, I guess it's still similar to Too Late for Love when it gets going, but I also think it's very much like the Mirror Mirror sounding bass in the verses. You know, it's just kind of staying on that D. I'm going to play it like a chord, but it's like, you know, so it's like the bass is just doubling up with the kick drum and the snare, and just it makes the rhythm section like sound massive, basically. I always like that on this song, and of course also on Mirror Mirror and when the verses get a bit heavier on Too Late for Love also. In fact, what else? I think Action Not Words has that similar kind of bass rhythm in there too. But yeah, so the rest of the song, lyrically again, it's great, and the backing vocals again sound absolutely massive. Production's top quality. And yeah, I mean, it's an absolute killer track. Throwaway track, I don't know what they're on about, but definitely one of my favourites. Now we've reached the final track in Kings of Oblivion. Now I admit I'm not too big on this track, but there's a lot of interesting parts in here. And weirdly enough, although I wouldn't say it references a lot of like classic stuff, for some reason this song reminds me of On Through the Night. And I think I've just found out why. I mean, there's a couple of similarities here. But before I do that, I'll just say with the rest of the elements there. Again, like all the other kind of newer sounding songs on here, it's mainly the backing vocals that give us that classic Leopard vibe. Everything else is like a bit more new to us. So this is definitely more like a modern sounding song, although it does have some classic elements in here. So yeah, so like the whole idea with like On Through the Night, there's two main parts that remind me of On Through the Night. The more obvious part I'd say would be there's like a part in the solo on Kings of Oblivion which kind of sounds like this, something like. Something like that, and for some reason that reminds me of the part in On Through the Night, which kind of goes like this. You know, it's the same chords being used there. So that kind of gives me that On Through the Night vibe. But also the main kind of, the main intro riff, not the intro riff, the main riff of like, once it goes in after the intro and everything gets heavy. And I think it's the verse riff as well, yeah. I'll play it in a clean sound so you can hear the chords. So it's basically, you're playing these kind of odd chords over a sustain and A note. So it sounds like this. It's like. And you're kind of doing something similar on Through the Night. You're doing, you know, you have a sustain and A note and you're playing kind of odd chords over it. You know, we're doing a similar sort of thing there, and for some reason that gives me like the same sort of vibe there. But I'd maybe say what Kings of Oblivion does is comparable in a way to what Disintegrate does, and that it's using, well, I keep using the term exotic chords, but I guess what I should be saying is like, it's a bit more like Eastern sounding chords, in terms of how they sound in connection with the scales and that. But you know, like on Kings of Oblivion, you're hearing this kind of chord. And we hear that a lot on the kind of modern lep sound to make it more, to get more interesting guitar parts. We seem to be, rather than maybe sticking with like the usual kind of Western pop sounding chords and trying to find an interesting way to use them, we're kind of going more towards like Eastern sounding like intervals. And like we say, we heard that a lot in slang, and we definitely hear it on, you know, on the kind of more modern sounding tracks on Euphoria here as well. So yeah, guitar part wise, I mean, we're moving away from like the classic Leopard sound. You know, the classic Leopard sound's coming from the production and the backing vocals, like what I've been saying with a lot of the modern tracks on Euphoria. And even in the chorus progression, for example, it's very modern Leopard in that it's a bit out there with its like chromatic use again. You know, it's something like if I was just play the bass notes, it's like kind of a bit all over the place there, and it's definitely more alternative kind of sounding rock. But pair that with the kind of big backing vocals, which, you know, do hold their melody, and it kind of gives us that cool kind of merge of the something old and something new there. So I think that's all I can say about Kings of Oblivion, and I think that's all I can say about the album as a whole. So I hope this video has shown all the little hidden references back to like Pyromania and Hysteria that you can find in the album. But I hope it's also shown that Euphoria isn't just that, you know, typical cliche Def Leppard nostalgia album as some have criticised it as being. You know, there's a lot of new elements in here, And in particular on songs like Day After Day, Paper Sun, Promises, you know, the band have been able to merge those classic elements with the kind of new influence as well to create something I think is quite unique sounding. So yeah, if there's any little hidden references that I've missed in this video, then please let me know. I hope I can bring some more analysis style videos like this, and of course I'll hopefully get back to the cover videos very soon as well. Thanks again.